Lucia was focused. She walked the busy streets of the exclusive neighborhood, discreetly watching for signs indicating suspicious activity. As the head of the police department, she knew she had to be on the lookout for information that could link corruption among her own colleagues. Her job was not easy, especially as a black woman in a position of power in a predominantly white institution. She adjusted her tie and continued to watch the movement in front of her. Luxury cars sped by without caring about the traffic or the people around them. But something caught her attention. A woman, apparently lost, was talking to two men. Lucia knew that, to a distracted observer, it might seem like a simple conversation, but her instincts told her otherwise. She hid behind a lamppost, trying to see the scene more clearly without anyone noticing. That's when he heard the sound of a motorcycle approaching. Carlos, a recently promoted police officer still adapting to his new role, passed by. He saw the scene and, with a suspicious look, quickly approached. "Hey, you!" he shouted, pointing at Lucia, who instinctively turned around. "What are you doing here?" He approached aggressively. Lucia, surprised by the hostile attitude, tried to explain. "I'm just looking. I'm a cop." Carlos looked her up and down, his eyes full of suspicion. He didn't seem to believe her. With a disdainful tone, he said, of course, as if a woman like you could be a police officer. You're on the street doing nothing. It looks like you're hiding something." Carlos's tone became more threatening, and Lucia felt a growing tension in the air. The instinct to fight awakened in her, but she remained calm. "I'm the head of the department, Carlos," she said, her voice firm and controlled. But her words didn't seem to convince the young police officer, who, already overcome with arrogance, pushed her forward. What followed was a chain of rapid and disastrous events. Carlos treated her like a criminal, taking her to the police station without questioning her identity, without even considering the possibility that he was making a mistake. Upon arriving at the police station, Lucia was thrown into a cell without explanation, where she hit her head on the bars and passed out. I knew that I would have to remember that humiliation, but that it could also, deep down, be the beginning of a great change. Lucia woke up with her head throbbing and pain running through every muscle in her body. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the cold and dirty environment that surrounded her, a police cell. She tried to get up, but her hands were handcuffed, and her blurred vision made it difficult to understand what was happening. There were voices in the background, but nothing made sense at that moment. There was the sound of a door opening, and a police officer came in looking at her. Lucia tried to focus, still dazed, trying to remember what had happened. Then his voice broke the silence. "I know what you're doing here, but you have no chance of escaping," he said with a sneer. Lucia looked at the police officer and recognized the voice of Carlos, the man who had assaulted her and detained her without any justification. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and the fear he felt mixed with his growing anger. Carlos took a step forward. "Are you going to tell me what you were doing, or will I have to do the dirty work again?" he said, his tone threatening. He took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. I knew that as difficult as it was, I needed to remain calm. His eyes shone with the coldness of someone who is used to dealing with situations like this. But this was not just another case of disrespect. It was a question of dignity. He remembered his career in the police force, how he had fought to get to the position he held. Everything now seemed like a nightmare. It was then that Carlos, still not knowing who she really was, began to question her more intensely. And it was at that moment that Lucia made a decision. The anger that was growing inside him turned into an unbreakable willpower. "I'm the head of the department, Carlos," Lucia said, her voice firm and sharp as a blade. The officer looked at her with wide-eyed surprise. "What?" Carlos didn't seem to believe it. You're the boss?" Lucia didn't need to answer. The silence between them grew heavy. She was there, a victim of injustice, but also the woman who had the power to change everything. She wasn't just another black woman facing racism. She was someone with authority, and now she would be heard. After his true identity was revealed, the tension in the police station was palpable. Carlos stood there, unsure of how to react. Lucia watched him intently with an implacable gaze as she tried to process everything that had happened up until that moment. The police officer still seemed stunned by the revelation, unsure of how to approach the situation. For a brief moment, Carlos left the room, and Lucia had a chance to breathe. Anger was growing inside her, but she knew she couldn't act impulsively. Her mission now was to make sure her position was respected without resorting to provocations or impulsive behavior. After all, she was at the police station where she, as the chief, should be in control of the situation. The door opened again, and this time it was Chief Gustavo, an experienced man, but with a nervous temperament. He looked at Lucia in surprise, recognizing her immediately, but still not knowing how to deal with what had happened. Carlos' posture. Lucia stood up, now completely recovered from the confusion, and looked the deputy directly in the eyes. He arrested me for no reason. He attacked me and humiliated me. I'm not just a police officer, Gustavo. I'm the head of the department. And now, Carlos, let's see how you face the consequences of your actions. The deputy seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He knew he couldn't ignore Lucia's complaint, but he also knew that Carlos was a good police officer, despite his mistakes. The atmosphere became even more tense, and Lucia's words echoed around the room, making it clear that she was determined to move forward with the complaint without giving in. You will be responsible for this, Carlos. Lucia's tone was firm, but her gaze reflected a feeling of helplessness in the face of so many injustices that he represented. Suddenly, a new factor entered the equation. Carlos, still visibly nervous, tried to justify his actions. He knew that at that moment, his career could be at risk, and this made him desperate. I didn't know who you were. He tried to explain, but his voice cracked, showing panic. Lucia looked at him silently for a few seconds. She knew he was just trying to save himself, but for her, what mattered now was what he would do next. The humiliation was profound, but the improvement was just beginning. The minutes that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. The heavy silence in the room was interrupted only by the sound of Carlos' nervous tapping on the table. He was visibly shaken, trying to find a way out of the situation he found himself in. Lucia remained calm, with an upright and authoritative posture, showing no signs of weakness. He knew that this moment could be decisive for his future, but also for the change that needed to occur in the police force. Gustavo looked at Carlos, trying to analyze the situation more clearly. He knew that the young officer's behavior was not justifiable, but he still had doubts about how to deal with him. He approached the table, placing his hand on Carlos' head. What you did, Carlos, was unacceptable. The congressman had no more patience for excuses. You used your authority abusively, and more importantly, you did not respect someone who holds a position like Lucia's. But you are not the only one responsible for this. We need to look at the system as a whole, and that includes me too. Lucia felt a mixture of relief and skepticism. The promise that Carlos would be held accountable for his actions was a small step, but she knew that real change would only occur if the power structures within the police were challenged more deeply. He took a deep breath and with a serious look said, Gustavo, you know this isn't just because of Carlos. The problem is broader. It's about how the police treat citizens, how they treat authority and respect. This has to change from the inside out. Carlos was visibly embarrassed, his shoulders slumped and his head down. He knew his career was at stake, but he still couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had caused. Lucia looked at him with a cold, almost distant gaze. knowing that his journey of humiliation was not over yet, but his goal was clear. Justice. "I will act, and you will learn the hard way," Lucia said firmly as Carlos walked away, as if he was already seeing his career crumble before his eyes. But this incident also lit a fire inside Lucia. That feeling of injustice, that humiliation she had suffered, now fueled her determination. She was ready to stand up to the corrupt system that had allowed this kind of behavior for so long. The power game was beginning, and she was ready to fight. The next morning came with an unusual weight. Lucia was home, alone, but her mind was far from at rest. That night, she decided that she could not allow the humiliation she had suffered to be just an isolated chapter in her life. Her fight would not be just for herself, but for all those who, like her, were victims of police violence, discrimination, and lack of respect within the institution. She got up early, drank a strong coffee, and went to the office of Gustavo, the police chief who had accompanied her, but also a potential ally. He knew that his support could be crucial to the change he wanted, but he was also aware that his words and actions needed to be analyzed with caution. He was a pragmatic man, but with a sense of justice that, although distorted, could be shaped forever. Upon arriving at the office, Lucia was greeted with a serious expression on Gustavo's face. "Lucia, I've been thinking about everything that happened. Carlos' case can't be treated as an isolated incident. We need changes within the police force, but we also know that it won't be easy," he said, as if in an attempt to calm the tension that still hung in the air. Lucia sat there looking at Gustavo. Her decision had already been made, but she needed to be sure that he was on her side. Trust would be the basis of any action they took from now on. "It's not just Carlos, Gustavo. You already know that. This is a reflection of a bigger problem. We need internal reform and stricter control of behavior. We cannot allow this kind of attitude to be tolerated. We cannot allow more lives to be destroyed like mine yesterday." Gustavo thought for a moment, apparently reflecting on Lucia's words. He knew that real change would not come from the outside in, but from the inside out. However, the structures within the police were very rigid, and he was also aware that any action to change the system would meet with resistance. However, he could no longer ignore the truth. "You're right," he finally said with a deep sigh. "I will launch a broader investigation, not just into Carlos, but into the practices in our unit. And if that's necessary, I will support your view." Lucia felt a wave of relief, but she knew the journey was far from over. Gustavo's words were a start, but the real fight would be longer, harder, and would require more than institutional support. She was willing to face any obstacle, to challenge any system, because she now knew that improvement was not just personal, but also for all those who had been marginalized and silenced. She would be the voice of those who had no power. The investigation began slowly but steadily. Lucia and Gustavo met frequently, discussing strategies and evaluating evidence while trying to open their colleagues' eyes to the corruption and errors in the police system. But as the investigation progressed, Lucia felt more pressure, not only from external challenges, but from the growing internal battle she faced. Carlos' words and the way he treated her couldn't get them out of her head. The emotional pain didn't dissipate, even with Gustavo's support and the promise of systemic change. Every time she walked into the police station, the gazes of the other officers seemed to pierce her like a sharp knife, reminding her of her vulnerability. They didn't see her as a leader, but as a humiliated woman. And that, no matter how much she tried to ignore, still affected her. That afternoon, while reviewing documents, Lucia was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. It was Carlos, the police officer who had assaulted her. He was on the street, apparently remorseful and looking for an opportunity to apologize. His heart beat faster and he hesitated for a moment. Carlos had been arrogant throughout most of the trial, but now he seemed to be seeking redemption. Was this for real, or just an attempt to smooth things over to save his career? She decided to meet him, perhaps not as a police officer, but as a woman willing to give one last chance to someone who had caused so much harm. She walked over to where he was waiting for her, under the dim light of a streetlight. Carlos looked different. His shoulders were slumped, and the expression on his face showed genuine remorse. He was no longer in uniform, but his demeanor was that of a broken man who had lost his position and his pride. "Lucia, he began with a trembling voice before falling silent. Lucia looked at him, waiting for him to say what he seemed to want to say so much. He was breathing heavily, but he maintained a rigid posture. There was no more room for easy forgiveness, but at that moment she knew it was time to face not only the enemies around her, but also those who, in some way, carried the same demons within themselves. "You've humiliated me enough, Carlos. Now is the time for you to understand what it means to truly confront your actions. I don't expect an apology, but I do expect real change." His voice was firm, but it carried a tension that he tried to control. Carlos looked at the floor, swallowing his words, while Lucia knew that this conversation, although painful, was just another step towards true justice.